ngā mātauranga mo te tangata. Hei huarahi atu ki te oranga. Kia pua wai te iwi, kia tu tangata. Po mana po ki te ao. Mā wai koe e arahi e tiaki. Mā wai koe e tautoko e manaki. Kia pua wai te iwi, kia tu tangata. Mā mana po ki te ao. Mā mana po ki te ao. Huie taiki.
Kia ora koto, mari mari kompute, good night, good afternoon, good morning, buenas tardes, boa tarde, guten Abend. On behalf of the Americas, Middle East, and Europe team at Education New Zealand, Mana Pūtaiao, I would like to welcome you to our Kōrerorero session today. My name is Javiera Vicedo, and I'm the Director of Education for Chile and Colombia for Education New Zealand, Mana Pūtaiao. It is with great pleasure that I introduce you to today's moderator of Kōrerorero, Dr. SarahJane Tiakiwai. SarahJane Tiakiwai is the Deputy Vice Chancellor Māori at the University of Waikato. Prior to taking up this appointment in April 2017, SarahJane spent 7 years as the inaugural academic director for the Waikato Tanui College for Research and Development. SarahJane has worked extensively in growing the capability and capacity of Māori and Kaupapa Māori researchers and creating opportunities for Māori students to engage in and contribute to iwi development and Māori business nationally and internationally. Hola, I'm SarahJane. A very warm welcome to you. Over to you now. Kia ora.
Hola, Javiera. Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. And greetings from Aotearoa New Zealand. It's wonderful to have everybody join us today. Nau mai, haere mai, and welcome everyone to our Kōrerorero session. Sustainability in Aotearoa New Zealand through the lens of Māori values and culture. We are really pleased and excited to have people joining us from different parts of the world today. Kia ora to you all in the US, Germany, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and here in Aotearoa New Zealand. I'll let the speakers introduce themselves in a moment, but first, some housekeeping information. This session is being recorded and you will be able to watch it on demand from tomorrow on this platform. If you have questions, please use the Q&A box and please make your questions in English. In the next 10 days, you will receive a certificate of attendance if you attend at least 50% of the session. So keep an eye on your email. We'll be collating the questions as we go and we'll ask the panellists a selection of questions at the end. We will do our best to try to answer as many of your questions, but we apologise in advance if we aren't able to answer your question today. It's my pleasure to give the word to each of the panellists an opportunity to introduce themselves today. And let me start with the phenomenal Traci Houpapa. Tēnā koe, Traci.
Tēnā rā koe, SarahJane. Buenos dias, Javiera. A tātou katoa me ngā mihi. My name is Traci Houpapa. I'm a professional director here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I serve on boards and companies, largely in the primary industry and Māori economic development sector. I'm delighted to join you all. Back to you, SarahJane.
Kia ora, Tracy. Ngā mihi nui ki a koe. It's my pleasure also to hand time over now to my esteemed colleague, Reece.
Thank you, SarahJane. Kia ora koutou katoa from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Sometimes we refer to it as the Paradise Islands in the Southwest Pacific. So it's an enormous privilege and honour to be having this opportunity to talk with you today. I have been involved in the interface between science, research and innovation, policy and strategy for the New Zealand government and with many of our Māori Indigenous enterprises and people. So hopefully I can bring that insight with you today. My day job is I work for one of our national science challenges, Science for Technological Innovation, and so hopefully I can bring that insight as well. So looking forward to today. Kia ora tātou.
Tēnā koe, Reece. Thank you for your introduction. And last but not least, the member for our panel. Actually, if I can just do a brief intro before she does. The first Māori Indigenous astrophysicist that we have here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Dr. Pauline Herrera. Hand the time to you.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou. Ko wai au, ko Pauline Herrera ahau, no rongo mai wahine ngā takahangunu ki Wairua. My tribes are up the top of Hawke's Bay in Aotearoa. I'm a senior lecturer at Victoria University of Wellington. I'm also on the same science challenge as Reece and with the McDiarmid Institute. And I do a lot of my research around reviving our traditional or our ancestral celestial and astronomical knowledge. And work within that space in the area of sustainability. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe, Pauline. Thank you, and thank you, our panel members. I'm going to move straight into our questions now. And the first question for all is, how can Indigenous lenses to sustainability be incorporated by governments and institutions worldwide? And what is the importance of including those Indigenous perspectives? Tracy, I might ask if you start us off with that.
Sure, SarahJane, it's a great question and a great opener. If COVID-19 has taught us anything, it has reminded us of what's most important in the world. And if you think about the trends from consumers, customers and markets, we are all worldwide thinking about how we can take care of our people and how we can take care of our environment and our countries. And so the Indigenous principles and values of looking after people, of looking after the environment and looking after the community and societies that we live in is now becoming key planks and stratagems for businesses, especially here in Aotearoa. We are seeing industry and government and Māori working together in partnership to develop and co-create and co-design systems and strategies that focus us on more of a circular economy and a regenerative economy.
Kia ora, Tracy. Reece?
Yes, well, Tracy has articulated it all very succinctly for us. And so the only bit that I will add is that Indigenous perspectives, as we know, have very broad and long timelines. It is not unusual to see 100-year, 500-year, or even in some cases 1,000-year plans, whether that's a business plan, whether it's a sustainability plan, an environmental plan, a population plan. And as we know, that is not unique just to Indigenous peoples in this part of the world, but throughout. So the fact that we look at it through that lens means that our priorities, as Tracy's talked about, and our values are very different to those of traditional Western values. So that's a key point. The other thing I think, and Tracy's alluded to it, is the world is waking up to the fact that Indigenous peoples actually add value. They are not a burden to our society, has previously been articulated, but it is the added value that Indigenous peoples bring to the way that we think as a planet. And that value comes in many forms, and in some cases there's a dollar value also attached that some people relate to more. But as we know, Indigenous peoples have this quadruple bottom line approach to our value system, and so that's being more and more appreciated by non-Indigenous communities. So thank you.
Thank you, Reece. Pauline.
Kia ora. I actually kind of teach some stuff like this in our courses, and usually I try to kind of wind it back so that a lot of people that we have in our classes are from the government kind of sector, and they, you know, when we talk about our values and that, sometimes they don't actually understand that kind of fundamental pillar where those values come from. And I think within the government sector and that, I think there needs to be, of course, implementation, but that real understanding of where those values actually come from and their interconnectedness. So for Māori, we have an understanding that we're interconnected with all of the world, all of the beings and entities that you find in the world. And we may define things such as living beings and non-living beings differently to that of non-Indigenous peoples. And having that kind of real fundamental understanding, I think, is quite critical in the way that people and governments, etc., engage with Māori knowledge and Māori understandings so that they can implement things properly. So especially our values, our sense of belonging in the place of the world, and Māori have, and Indigenous people have this understanding and duty of care for our environment. So putting those values ahead of our economic values, or building in those values of caring for the world and other beings or other species, building that into whether or not we legislation or law, whether or not that's on that larger scale of a national government or in policies and that we find in councils, etc. So embedding them in, but really truly understanding what where those values come from, I think is really quite critical, because in New Zealand we do implement things within our legislation and, you know, within our aims and objectives to go towards like carbon zero, etc., remediating our environmental issues, etc., and just making sure that we have a very good Indigenous understanding and Māori understanding of how those things will actually roll out. And I think that's quite an important point that we need to make sure that we get. Because sometimes they throw around words that are Māori and Indigenous, but sometimes they're not used correctly, or they're used very broadly, but having that fundamental understanding. Kia ora.
Fine. Thank you, Pauline. I think across the three quite distinct but connected responses, you know, I think important perhaps around the idea of co-creation and co-design, the threads are about quadruple bottom line, and I think probably that point that you made, Pauline, about the duty of care to our whole world. So I think, you know, in terms of sustainability, it's understanding that we as people don't exist, we exist within a whole ecosystem. And probably the last takeaway I got from your responses was really about understanding and really understanding what Indigenous perspectives and values are and how you embed that for implementation. So perhaps some takeaways there. So thank you all as an opening question. I have a specific question now for you, Traci, which is, what are the opportunities and challenges that the private sector is facing most when striving for more sustainable practices? And how do you see Māori values shaping this journey?
Thanks, SarahJane. Across the world, there has been a renewed and proper emphasis on environmental and social goals. There has been more of an emphasis on social corporate responsibility, and there has been more of an emphasis moving from volume to value and looking at customer-led, consumer-focused delivery. And so those corporate or commercial stratagems have actually aligned corporate and private sector on a pathway, probably unexpectedly and unintentionally, which is driven very much by Indigenous and by First Nations principles, vision and value. And so we're starting to see that in organisations where they are looking at fair trade sourcing, where they're looking after people. We're starting to see that in terms of how corporates or private sector are starting to look at trace and point of origin for their goods and services. And we're starting to see that in terms of changes, thank goodness, and it's about time, in terms of employment and workplace practices. So for Māori, we say, he aha te mea nui o te ao, what is the most important thing in the world? And we say, he tangata, it's people. So the idea of a consumer-focused, market-led approach isn't new for Māori because we've always put people at the centre of our considerations in terms of economic development. And for those of us who have always struggled with how economics fits with a First Nations or Indigenous people's viewpoint, good economics is about how we set policies and systems and societies around people to share wealth and well-being. So for me, as the chair of some of New Zealand's more successful companies and organisations, I'm always focused on how we can bring a te ao Māori view, a Māori worldview, into our systems and strategies. And Reece Moores just before talked about the intergenerational focus, which is specifically or perhaps uniquely Indigenous and First Nations. So I have chaired a company that has been owned by our family for over 120 years. I want to go down in history as somebody who has added value to that company. And a 100-year strategy is normal for us as Māori. We think in terms of 100, 500 and 1,000 years. And to Dr. Harris's point a little earlier, we see ourselves as part of the wider ecosystem whereby we are considerate of and considerate for, care for everything that is within our environment. So, for example, at the moment, one of the things that Māori and the New Zealand government is working on at the moment are two key strategies that will change industry, government and Māori for good, which is around the prestige or place of water and the prestige and place of the environment. So, i roto i te reo Māori, in our Māori language, we call that te mana o te Pūtaiao and te mana o te wai. Now, those two strategies recognise the environment and water as living and critical beings and enablers in the New Zealand or Aotearoa economy. To give a further example of that, SarahJane, before I hand it back to you, is we also have in New Zealand a river which has been given a legal personification, Te Awatupua, our Whanganui River, and we also have mountains and lakes that in New Zealand have been given legal personification. The reason that I'm explaining or answering your question like this, SarahJane, is because it gives context and framework for Māori and First Nations, Indigenous values and principles that are clearly cultural first and commercial and economic soon after. Back to you, SarahJane.
Dawe, that was a wonderful answer. Thank you, Traci. I guess that the key point, well, there are many takeaway points there, and one perhaps which might flow into a question I'm about to ask Reece, which is really about Māori or Indigenous worldviews are more than just a perspective, and it's really the challenge on all of us around how it's embedded in practice. So Reece, I'll turn to you now and ask the question from your role. What is the role of research, science and technology in New Zealand and supporting sustainable goals and practices from a Māori perspective? But what does best practice look like when government works closely with Māori to enable Māori to use science and innovation towards sustainability?
Kia ora, and thank you, SarahJane. I think the first thing is we have to set the context where our Māori Indigenous peoples here in Aotearoa New Zealand have a unique constitutional arrangement with the government of the day. It is known as the Treaty of Waitangi. Some of our international guests may not be aware of that. Signed in 1840 with the Crown. And that translates today into a document, a partnership, a strategic alliance with the government of the day between our Indigenous peoples. As you can imagine, these things are always fraught and have their tensions, and have done since that document was signed and even before it was signed. So the essence of how that sort of translates, dropping it down about 15 levels to our New Zealand science system for Māori, for our Indigenous peoples, it's simply nothing about us without us, which simply means as we launch into opportunities, into projects, into big challenges, of which of course sustainability is one of those, Māori feel that not only do they have a right to be at the decision-making table, but they also have an obligation. And that is set within the treaty context that I've just explained, but also all the values and the worldview that we've referred to earlier. So there's an enormous value add to that conversation for Māori to be at that table. So the way that that translates into the New Zealand science system, which I think is still unique around the world, but Pauline and Sarah are probably closer to this than I am. But the New Zealand government has this policy framework called Vision Mātauranga, which essentially refers to realising the potential that sits within Māori people, assets and resources, and has 4 themes themed around the environment, themed around health sciences, themed around Indigenous science, and themed around economic well-being or economic prosperity in its widest definition. Now, that policy framework is a government framework, albeit was developed by one of our great Indigenous thought leaders, Charles Royal, with a panel of other experts. But that sets a context for how the New Zealand science system responds in this space. It's something that no longer can it be ignored. No longer is it just a matter of consultation, but requires our science community to take seriously the value that Indigenous science brings. And Pauline particularly is involved in this, and I know, Sarah, you're involved in it as well, is what is that interface between Indigenous knowledge, what we refer to as Mātauranga, and Western science? And what is the value that occurs because of those two knowledge systems coming together? So we see this, Tracy's already referred to the circular economy. We see this in a number of Māori enterprises who do this almost automatically, and in some cases they don't even know that they do it until some academic sort of flies in, and observes them. We have a wonderful best case, the best practice case in New Zealand that I'd like to refer to, which is Tuaropaki Trust. Now, Tuaropaki Trust is based in the middle of the North Island of New Zealand and lives the sustainability model. They have a geothermal power station. The power from that is generated to keep their glass houses warm, where they produce pepper, capsicum, tomatoes for export. Any waste from that is then taken back into the farm and reused in a worm farm, and I understand worms sell for something like $40 a kilo, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is we'll send the link so that you've got it on the website of this trust. But it's a wonderful example, and their latest venture into technology is into the opportunity to export hydrogen energy around the world, and they will do that through using the sustainability of their geothermal energy to produce the hydrogen, for example. So it is just one example of how you sort of combine, the value system that underpins how our Māori organisations operate. We referred to it before, this quadruple bottom line, investing in, social, environmental, cultural, economic, and a whole lot of other foundational value systems, so that something that occurs within one part of an enterprise doesn't negatively impact on another because of, as we've referred to before, this investment in our people. So you see this interaction between science, traditional Western science, and Indigenous science, and it is a constant tension. We lack an enormous capacity and capability, particularly on our mātauranga, our Indigenous knowledge side. People like Pauline and Sarah are pulled literally from one thing to another thing because of the rare skill and the rare worldview that they bring. And that's a constant challenge, is how do we maintain that capability so that it can add value to our wider science, not only here in Aotearoa New Zealand, but internationally. So I'll stop there and throw it back to SarahJane. Kia ora.
Thank you, Reece. I think, again, some really valid points, and one hopefully that I can weave into Pauline's question, which is really about that intersect or the interface that you talked about between mātauranga Māori or Indigenous knowledge and Western science. So, Pauline, a question for you, because you do have a background in both Western science and mātauranga Māori, and oftentimes Western science is seen as the predominant way of learning, and Indigenous knowledge is not held in the same esteem. Can you share your thoughts on the value of Indigenous knowledge or ways of learning and the detriment to excluding it as a valued knowledge?
Hi, kia ora. I think probably here contextualise it, because in our research, we're really working at that interface between the Western science and mātauranga Māori. But I come from a physics background, and then that's all I was taught. So just in our education system, when we were being brought up, we hardly had any mātauranga Māori and Māori language. So we didn't have any Māori knowledge taught to us, and we didn't have any Māori language taught to us. And so many of us, especially in the sciences, came through and we've got these PhDs in that in science, and then we've gone on to go, I really need to learn my mātauranga Māori. How do I do this? And it takes time, right? So it's taken like 10 or 20 years to even play a little bit of a catch up. And I think that's one thing that really kind of made me realise, when people are really dismissive, and they have been over the past, dismissive of our Indigenous knowledge, they're being dismissive, but they don't even know anything about it, And so they don't even have any valid standing to even criticise, because they actually don't understand. And so I must say that, from 20 years ago, it's a much different picture, or 20 years before that, the picture is drastically changing to nowadays. There is way more respect for mātauranga Māori, and in fact, our latest announcement has been the incorporation of the government has announced Matariki, our Māori New Year, to be a public holiday, which it's huge. So that's, that's on a national scale of implementation of Māori knowledge being understood and recognised as important, which is absolutely huge. And that's been a huge body of work that sits behind it for 20, 30 years. And so some other points too is so that valuing of it is changing. Yeah, but it's still, we still see it throughout the system. Like Reece said, it's really challenging. Not everybody responds in that positive way of seeing its value. But the value that I've seen coming from a Western science training perspective is that it's absolutely mind-blowing. Like the amount of knowledge that our knowledge holders know it just overwhelms me sometimes. Just how much knowledge they have, especially on a local level. So we can have, textbooks that have information about observations of the environment, and it's all very quite wide and broad. But when you have local knowledge of people who live and observe things for decades to centuries, and other Indigenous peoples observing the land and the environment over millennia, how can you beat that when it's like this knowledge and information that's been collected and passed down over generations for survival as well as interest, as well as lots of other things. But the observations over generations is just, there's a richness to it that you can't get from a Western science system. Also, the values that we bring. So a lot of them will talk about the our perspectives of how we engage with knowledge as well. That's hugely different. So we come along with a different lens, as we had in the earlier question, but a different framework and a different perspective that helps you analyse your data or your information differently. Yeah, so if you have an interconnected model of how you engage and look at the world, then your model is going to be very different from looking at it from a Western science perspective that might be more compartmentalised, or, investigating things on a more micro scale, isn't that big, larger macro scale. And it's really challenging. It's extremely brilliant, actually, listening to our knowledge holders, and I always feel like I'm on the back step with them, but that's all good, because that's just part of the learning journey, right? And being respectful in how you move through that. And I think Western science also needs to understand that quite nuanced. And me and SarahJane worked on a project they led it a long time ago, Te Haumahiata, yes, that looked at that kind of engagement between Western science and mātauranga Māori or Māori knowledge experts. And so those ways that you engage has to be done properly, because, you don't want to offend anybody, and you really need to really understand how you communicate. Just like when you go overseas, you make sure you know how to engage with the people of that land. And so that's another thing too. But yeah, I could talk for quite a while on that, but I'll stop there. But kia ora.
Ngā mihi nui, Pauline. Yes, it has been an interesting observation to see how Indigenous knowledge has been more broadly not just accepted within Aotearoa New Zealand, but incorporated. So that notion of embedding into practice, we feel we still have a long way to go. But I might just ask a general question for each of our panel members now, and that's really, again, kind of pulling on some of the things that you have talked about already, which is more around your own personal Māori heritage perspectives and values, and have they guided you into your work, or how does that work? How do you draw on your own knowledge systems and values in the work that you do? Perhaps, Reece, I might start with you and then go to Pauline and then finish with Traci.
Yes, SarahJane. Well, I think today's panel is a perfect example of that, because our Māori world is dominated by the care, consideration and leadership of our female leaders. And that has certainly been the influence on me. We often refer to in the Māori world as our aunties or our nannies or our grandmothers. And it's them that carry that knowledge and feel that deep responsibility. And for me, that was certainly the case. So my grandmother would take me to a number of our trust board or our Māori enterprise meetings. You would sit in the back of the room. These would not be in extremely, luxurious environments. They're in small halls, some of our traditional meeting houses. Some of them were cold, wet. Sometimes the roof was leaking. And we would talk about the future of our people. And so what it infused in me is a great sense of social justice. How do we promote and support what we have and what we've managed to hang on to for future generations to come, knowing that even me as a 9-year-old grandchild sitting in that room may not even personally ever benefit from the work that was happening in that day. So it was infused by those old people who drilled in us that deep sense of intergenerational responsibility, that we were blessed with a home and a loving family. And for some of us, we were fortunate to be brought up with a relatively good education, albeit in some cases, our Indigenous side of our education was lost because of colonial impact. But that we had to use those tools to promote and support an opportunity. And as others have said, what is our value add in the time that we're on this planet? So yeah, infused by osmosis, sometimes a little whack around the backside, sometimes a bit of a telling off to pay attention in a room and to really, really think about what, my particular role was in supporting and promoting that. So kia ora, SarahJane.
Thank you, Reece. Perhaps it was appropriate then how you responded that I started with you as our sole male on our panel today. Pauline, I'll hand it over to you.
Hi, kia ora. I think for me, just in terms of, my upbringing, because as I said, we didn't have our language and we didn't have a lot of our Māori history, but my mum Jean was brought up in Mahia, so she often used to talk about how they would live, and it was very much that subsistence living. Yeah? But also when we were growing up, she would also talk to me, it was kind of implicit, or, we weren't allowed to spray sprays on the land. The food scraps are always given back to the birds. Even still now, she names the birds when they come and they eat the fruit that's ripening on our trees. So that kind of real value coming through of the caring and the beauty of our world and really appreciating it, I think, is probably one of the strongest memories I have. And, Mum still does this, she'll stare outside the window and really absorb the actual magnificence and beauty of our world. Yeah. And that's an understanding of taking care of that world. And also when she would share stories, and when we go back to our homeland of Mahia, like being really able to understand and that feeling of really loving the land and really caring for the land. And, for Indigenous peoples, we often we always ask where we're from, and we identify with our mountains and our rivers that are from our places of origin, yeah? So from our homeland, from where my mother was born. And so there's that implicit understanding that you're from there and you are the land. Yeah, and we all know this, so within the panel, but yeah, that we are the land, we are the water that is there, we are everything around us. And I think that's something that's been really strong, even though we didn't have the language and we didn't have a lot of the history just through our previous education systems, there was still that understanding of your place in the world. And I think that's really been very, very influential in guiding a lot of all of the work, actually. It's just all of the work that we do. Yeah, I do. Kia ora.
Thank you, Pauline. Traci.
SarahJane, I have loved being on the panel and hearing from Reece and from Pauline with regards to their experiences and their whakapapa or background that they bring to their professional roles. And I think the short answer to your question, SarahJane, is yes. Of course, because how do you separate being Indigenous from who you are and how you respond or how you interact with society, whether that's at home or at your work? And I think in Aotearoa, in New Zealand, we are now in a time which is a gift, which is the time where people like Pauline's mum and family at Mahia and Reece's grandmother and grandparents fought for and demanded that we create a society in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where we can be Māori and we can bring our Māoriness to our businesses, to our workplaces and to our communities. And increasingly, living here, you can see that Te Ao Māori thinking or Māori worldview thinking is actually forming and informing and influencing and advising policy and strategy across government, and increasingly industry, and also we're bringing that ourselves in our own businesses and organisations. Reece talked a little bit before about one of our most successful New Zealand businesses that is owned by a Māori family, that is generational, and in 500 or 1,000 years' time it will still be owned by a Māori family. And that business is indicative and a great example, like other Māori businesses, where we consider how our Māori vision and values, looking after the people, the land, our communities and family, actually drive the business case. And so there is research that says when you take a values approach to business, you get a stronger, more sustainable, more predictable bottom line, and we're starting to see that across our businesses. where we take care of our people in our workplaces and in terms of being shareholders or beneficiaries of the business, where we look after them, then they are able to become more active, more valuable members of our society. We have made great progress as Māori people in New Zealand, and we are pleased to stay at the table as part of this discussion and decision making. For all of us, I'm sure Reece and Pauline will be nodding their heads, we've still got a way to go. So while in New Zealand, the Māori economy is worth circa 70 billion New Zealand dollars, we still need to focus on how we distribute that wealth and well-being to all of our people across the entire country and the world. And that is a challenge that Reece and Pauline and our other colleagues in whānau are up for. In short though, SarahJane, Indigenous and First Nations vision and values are integral to the future success, viability and sustainability of the planet and world in which we live on and live with. Nē rā tamihi ki a koe hoki, e hoa mā ki a koe te rangatiri e Jay. Sarah.
Ngā mihi, Traci, thank you. I think, the answers, probably the common thread across all of them is that as Indigenous peoples, and even as Māori, as the Indigenous peoples of Aotearoa New Zealand, we have diverse lived experiences. Some of us have had the privilege of growing up with our aunties and our nannies. Some of us have had the privilege of growing up with our language. Others not so much had that privilege for a whole range of reasons. But the common thread or value of who we are, as Traci mentioned, regardless of whether we had our association with place or our association with language, we are Indigenous by the mere fact that we are born Indigenous. And so, those common threads, I think, are the things that influence and shape our worldview. So I thank our panel for answering the questions in the way that you had. I'm going to pull now from questions from the audience, and actually I'm going to frame this question, which is about Māori knowledge in medicine, in a slightly different way, which is more around sustainable practice. And I want to frame it in regards to perhaps Māori knowledge in medicine, which we understand to be rongoa Māori or Māori medicine, and more around what are your views of how we can, what are the challenges around commercialisation of Māori medicine and the incorporation or inclusion of Māori knowledge in pharmaceuticals, and how can we engage, or as you say, be at the table and co-design and co-create, or be part of the decision-making processes as in this new environment, because I think particularly with COVID, it's really highlighted the importance of pharmaceuticals. So I'm kind of expanding on the question, but hopefully would be something that would be of value to our audience. Perhaps I might start with you, Reece.
I was afraid you'd do that. I was hoping you'd go to Pauline. All good. No, that's fine. Look, I think you're right. This is a great opportunity and a great time in our history. Probably the best way that I can answer this question is give a specific example. Some years ago, I was approached by one of our large tribal entities in the South Island called Ngāi Tahu, who have intellectual property over some of their flora and fauna, or their traditional flora and fauna, as a result of a treaty settlement process, and that is now locked into New Zealand legislation. They have a traditional plant called taramia, which was a traditional perfume used in New Zealand well before Europeans first arrived. Now, this could be a medicine, a rongoa. This happens to be a perfume. It may well have other properties. But where it worked really well was they approached some key scientists in areas of extraction to understand what were the scientific qualities within that flora and fauna. Why? Because they were approached by a commercial, in this case, a cosmetic company, It could have been a pharmaceutical company, and they wanted to know what was in their product before they went into negotiation. So it's understanding not only their traditional knowledge, but what is the Western value of this particular flora and fauna. And so the scientists were able to inform them so that they were able to go into those discussions fully informed. So the partnership developed, and essentially you had all the traditional knowledge that came from this tribal entity, Ngāi Tahu, the scientific knowledge, and some government support in terms of funding for the process, but also the commercial entity that was looking to develop this, but developing it with those with the knowledge and the value system that Ngāi Tahu brought to it, because commercially that added value as well. You know, we talk of Indigenous branding, for example. So that's a very economic answer to you, but it gives a model of when it actually does work well. I haven't gone back to look. I know that it's actually commercially available today. I haven't spoken to anyone from Ngāi Tahu in recent years to see if it's actually still working for them. But the model, I think, was a good one, and that could be applied also into the pharmaceutical sector. So that's just an example. So kia ora, SarahJane.
Thank you, Reece. I might ask Traci for you to come in now, particularly from that more business angle and, you know, the commercialisation or opportunities, I guess, where not just where Indigenous peoples can also benefit from the type of examples that Reece has shared.
Kia ora, SarahJane. Great answer, Reece, and I'm excited to be part of this conversation because it's so important. In New Zealand, as Reece mentioned, there are Māori businesses and organisations, tribes, who are looking at securing the intellectual property of plant species, flora and fauna, with regards to rongoa or medicinal, pharmaceutical and nutraceutical endeavours or enterprise. And so we're doing that for two reasons. One, for the potential commerciality of that, and two, to preserve, protect, nurture and enhance the cultural component of that plant species or that flora or fauna. And so while in the past that hasn't been a priority for a number of different reasons, increasingly maybe over the last 5 to 10 years, there has been an extraordinary amount of work being done on that, SarahJane. Coupled with that, work around geographical indicators, which talks to trace and traceability of rongoa or Māori medicines and medicinal plants and otherwise as well. I think going back to Pauline's comment about her mum, and I'm still standing in the kitchen with Pauline's mum looking out the window, to be honest, thanks for that, Pauline. But we see our plant, our flora and fauna and our environment as a place by which we might share energies. And so if we are unwell as Māori, then we need to support or protect or heal our energy system, or what is called our Mori. And so what we're effectively doing is we're taking the good energy and the good life force from our plants and plant species, and we are translating that into a good or service that might help the well-being or the life force of others. I think the other thing too here, SarahJane, that I'd say is this discussion and the question from our colleague with regards to Indigenous or Māori views on medicine really brings to the fore the move toward more holistic, more natural ways of medicine. And for us as Māori, we are more and are focusing more about being healthy and living in a healthy way, rather than being sick and then becoming well. So again, it's that whole whakaaro rangatiro, that higher order thought or commitment, which talks about being well and taking care of the whole person. I hope that helps our friend's question and answer with regards to medicine and Māori.
Thank you, Traci. Pauline, I wanted to ask you last, more from your, purely scientific lens, but equally, as Traci has so eloquently referred to about, your mother's experiences and the energies of being on land and being associated with place. If you could, from your perspective, provide some insight into that question.
Yeah, kia ora. I think I probably talk to it from a perspective of capability and capacity, which, kind of intertwines together. But I have had conversations with some iwi, some tribal members who have asked me questions of, a pharmaceutical company is interested in this particular species in my area. I don't really know what to do. And for me, it was a bit of a reaction of, oh gosh, some of our tribal groups are very onto it and they've got a lot of capability and capacity. And some of our other ones are still in the process of developing frameworks or businesses or just setting up themselves to be able to engage in quite a complex world, especially if you're being approached by pharmaceutical companies and the like. And there was a real concern from this person of how to engage. And they're like they're kind of like our mums and our aunties, right? They're not knowing how to engage. So I think that's quite an important aspect that we really need to help develop, is that support for our tribal members to be able to handle dealing with them, because some of the complexities around intellectual property, protection of the species, making sure you share the right information if you don't want to go down that path. So that's one aspect which is really important to mention. And then the other important thing to mention, I think, is our Indigenous people who are in the research world. So, I've had a lot of friends, Māori and Pacific scientists, who work around our traditional flora and fauna, right? Looking at their chemical properties and that. And, they're given opportunities, sometimes they're given scholarships, etc., and that, and then sometimes a lot of large expectations, especially if they're young researchers and that. And I think that's an area that really needs to be more honourably dealt with, so that those young people are looked after and nurtured, and then their skill set is developed and taken care of, which I think is slowly climbing up within Aotearoa New Zealand context, but really needs still a lot of work, especially in that kind of postgraduate young researcher, young scientists developing in that area, which they're all keen to have our Indigenous scientists be in that space, but really we need to ensure that they aren't burnt out, that they're taken care of, because it's the care of the people, right? And the care of the environment, the care of the whole holistic system, but then, making sure there's a wraparound. And so that's kind of, I think, maybe the main couple of points that I might make in terms of that. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Pauline. Thank you for that. I thought I would start with that question largely because of the commercial aspects and really how we incorporate or weave or pay homage and respect to Indigenous knowledge in this new world, as Traci mentioned, around the pharmaceutical and nutraceutical areas. One of the other questions that has come through, which is slightly related but more environmentally focused, which is around the changing legal status of our rivers, our mountains. And the question is around, the response of the private sector when the legal status changed. What are the opportunities that you see as panel members of how our environment is now becoming more legally recognised in and of their own right? And what are the opportunities that you see for that from an Indigenous perspective, and then how that might advance us in terms of sustainability? So Traci, I might actually ask you to start this one first.
Kia ora, SarahJane. It's a favourite topic of mine, so thank you for the question, Yahuama. The recognition in Aotearoa that Māori knowledge and te ao Māori thinking, or Māori worldview and world thinking, that acknowledgement is becoming an important part of our economic future. And when, to Reece's point, our nannies and aunts and uncles, our grandparents, made a call on government and Crown to recognise our key sites of significance, and in terms of mainstream New Zealand, economic enablers like our water for hydro, for energy, for power, and our mountains, which are effectively the beginning of our water source, our water table. Then what that particular piece, that acknowledgement in that legislation meant that the game had changed. That industry or private sector, corporate New Zealand, needed to take note that government and Māori recognised how important our environment was to the overall well-being and wealth of Aotearoa New Zealand at an economic level. And so while for Reece and Pauline and I, we understand that our mountains, our lakes, our river and our sea, our atua, are supported and protected by our atua, or our celestial beings or gods, at an economic level, corporate New Zealand recognised that in order to engage with Māori and government to access and use this energy or this water source or these places, that they needed to review, revise, firstly, the way in which they partner with Māori, secondly, how they use our environment and how they behave, interact and operate within our environment in order to continue to conduct their business, and thirdly, what the flow-on effect is, if you'd excuse the pun, for our communities in terms of employment, building the capacity and capability of Māori and or our communities in regional economic development. What it has done is very beautifully, SarahJane, it's demonstrated how we think as Māori. So while worldwide the recognition of a river as a legal person is quite innovative, certainly creative, for us as Māori, it's simply how we think. So our tribe in the middle of the North Island, Te Whare Toa, who has responsibility for custodial responsibility and care for that land and that environment, recognises the base of the lake as a receptacle for water that flows in from neighbouring tribal areas and lands. Now, Pauline and Reece and I think that's simply straightforward. It's common sense. Worldwide, that's seen as innovative. A classic example of Te Ao Māori thinking within a corporate and government world.
Kia ora. Thank you, Traci. Pauline, I might ask you to follow through, and then I'll leave the last word to Reece on that question.
Kia ora, and kia ora, Traci, for your answer. I guess I just want to follow on from that. I don't think I've got a lot to say, or maybe I do have a lot to say on it, but in terms of what I hope that it is doing and what I hope that it is changing, the recognising of something as being a being, so being able to shift into that space within the being and looking at the perspective from that being itself. So if you shift yourself, and this is some of the things I talk to my students about it, and hopefully that kind of filters out, but we can filter it out here with this giant classroom we have here. But, if you position yourself within that river, what is your perspective as that river of how all these other beings around you are treating it? How is your health? And how do you measure that health? So we usually talk about the Mori, or how the life essence of that entity or that river, and how do we measure that health? As being a doctor, from the perspective, the river is coming to you and you're the doctor and you're measuring the health and well-being of that river. So that, it's that changing relationship and changing understanding and respecting that being or river or mountain or piece of land or larger land, how they are feeling, whatever that really means, or how is it doing in terms of its well-being. And I think the fact that, for it to be shifted, these beings and entities being given that personification, which is completely, as Traci said, it's very normal for us to even talk like this. And so when things are normal, you're like, yeah, of course. But sometimes we forget to explain it, and people in government or people in other institutions, they don't actually sometimes we'll just glaze over it too, and they won't know what we're talking about. Yeah. And we just assume because it's so embedded within our mindset and the way that we view the world. So I think that acknowledgement as something as being its own being and being able to step into the mindset of being that being itself. I hope that makes sense. And to really kind of feel how is the health and well-being of that river or that mountain or that land going. And if you can shift into that perspective, then empathy will then be present. I actually think we even actually talked about empathy because it's implicit in actually what we're talking about. But having that empathetic connection to not just each other as humans, but having that empathetic relation with animals and all beings, including those that we recognise as being alive, such as the land, such as the rivers and the mountains. And I think I'm not too good on the economic thing, so thanks, Traci, for doing that, and Reece. But in terms of a heart level, I hope people have learnt about that here too, just step into that river and see how it's going. Yeah, kia ora.
Kia ora, Pauline. Reece.
Yes, I'm conscious of time, SarahJane. So Traci and Pauline have articulated this so well, so I'll keep this really succinct. It's about how the relationship changes within our mainstream environment, and that's where legislation becomes important. So what is this really? For me, it's about the power of information. And Māori have a set of information which sometimes the mainstream society sees and sometimes it doesn't. And I'll give one specific example. In 2006, the Māori world experienced a significant event, which was the passing of Dame Te Atairangi Kāhu, one of our paramount chiefs in Aotearoa New Zealand, our Māori Queen. This was a whole week-long event in New Zealand. Our mainstream state television news at 6 o'clock every night was broadcast from that funeral site for that entire week. But what did it culminate in? On the final day, as a result of the ceremony that the Māori world basically took over within the region, was that the state highway, in our State Highway 1, was closed for 6 hours. Our main trunk railway line was closed for 6 hours, so that we as Māori and as Waikato Tainui, on behalf of the entire motu, could mark this very traumatic and special occasion of the passing of Dame Te Atairangi Kāhu. Now, I had business people based in our largest business city in Auckland saying, what is this thing, this Māori world? Who is this little old lady? How is it that the Māori world can essentially close our state highway, close our main trunk line for 6 hours? Queen Elizabeth II is the constitutional head of state of New Zealand. When she travels here, she may close a highway for about 90 seconds. And something like this occurred, and it occurred from a bottom-up approach. So what it is as Traci has alluded to, and Pauline, the emergence of the Māori world, not only as a force of knowledge and support and values, but a different system. And people are now looking over the fence saying, what is this? We need to understand it. We need to interact with it, because information is power. And Māori have a set of information which they are very careful as to who they share it with, so that it gets treated with the dignity that it deserves. Kia ora, Sarah.
Kia ora, Reece. Thank you for that. On behalf of Education New Zealand, mana pai ki te ao, we really would like to thank you for joining us today. I'd like to pay tribute to our panellists. I think that while we didn't answer all the questions, I'm hoping that from what they did share today that you will take some key messages about heart, about listening, about empathy, but more about incorporation and embedding and understanding who we are as Indigenous peoples in sustainability, not only for us here in Aotearoa, but around the world. And we congratulate and sincerely thank them for sharing their perspectives on Kōrerorero today. We look forward to seeing you here in Aotearoa when the time is right, and we'll see you again online soon. And we leave you with these final words. Kia tau te uruhau, kia hāneanea te noho, kia marutau te haere. May joy and happiness surround you. May contentment shelter you and your loved ones. And we wish you safe journeys wherever you may be. Hei kona.